right. So I'm going to give the message that I was intending to give last week, and y'all are probably better off for it because you might not be eating yet if I had started last week. But we've been through a lot of these, the different common excuses. We started this like last year and trying to do this like once a month. Of some of the different things that we hear when talking to our friends and our family and why they don't necessarily want to join us on this journey. And I'm not going to go through all these again, but we've had fun, or I've had fun coming through them, and I keep asking for suggestions if there are verses or if there are topics that I haven't hit on. Um, we can certainly touch on certain things. And being in the age of grace, today's is more about this idea of all I need is Jesus. I'll be in heaven. That's kind of an excuse that many people use to try to dismiss any interest or any need. Why do I need this stuff that you guys keep talking about and bringing up all the time? Because I'm already saved. I'm already baptized. I've got Jesus. My ticket to heaven is already punched. What happens when I'm absent from the body? Then what? I'm going to be present with the Lord, right? So I've got nothing to worry about. I read my Bible. I've read the last page. I know that the victory is mine, and none of that Jewish stuff, none of that Sabbath keeping, none of the feasts are going to change where I'm going. Right? Anybody heard that one? That kind of stuff before? It's Jesus is all the world to me, as we would sing, and I don't really need anything else. I don't need to listen to what you're saying or to worry about anything missing from my faith because I know I am spirit filled. I'm blood bought. I've got all those types of things, and we say that, we know that, we hear that kind of thing. Yet at the same time, when we all get to heaven, as we would sing in the past, everyone wants to hear what a lot of people have been saying and talking about in the last couple of weeks about Charlie Kirk, where you hear people say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Y'all been hearing that one talked about a bit more this week? That comes out of Matthew 25. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a little, so I'll put you in charge of much. So enter into your master's joy. And so many people have been talking about that, thinking about that in terms of Charlie, that he's going to hear or he's heard that phrase because of all the work that he had been doing during the elections to help Trump or was out on college campuses. And it's just important to acknowledge, I don't really believe he was assassinated because of his political work. He was assassinated because of his biblical work. The message of Messiah, the scriptures, the supporting of Israel, getting kids and these college guys to reconsider faith in Christ, to stand for the biblical worldview that are on issues that are out there like abortion or all the LGBT issues. And he was organizing, the cynical younger generation to take things like faith, things like marriage and family more seriously. And if you hadn't heard, he was even starting to keep the Sabbath. Y'all heard about that? He's even written a book about that. Yes, he does. So we talk, and you hear a lot of people saying, if anyone was going to hear, well done, he should hear that. Surely after doing all of that, being killed for the faith, he would hear that. But that also makes, how many of us are doing all that? Right? By comparison, most of us aren't doing all that much. So are we as confident to hear the words, well done? That's the challenge. That's the dilemma. By saying, I hope that I hear well done, it implies something about it. Doesn't it kind of imply that not everyone is going to hear well done? Right? I sure hope I hear that. I want that to be true. In other words, it's not an automatic. It's not like a participation trophy where everybody's a winner. Which means there's got to be some kind of criteria, some kind of measurement by which God looks at us, looks at his people, and makes an assessment. So there's got to be a range of possibilities when it comes to salvation, or when it comes to his servants in the kingdom. On one end, we've got this, well done, my good and faithful servant. And so we ask that question, what is the criteria? Where is that spelled out? How do we make sense of that? We can be just like the rich young ruler who was, when he came and asked Yeshua a question about what must I do to inherit eternal life, and he goes through and says, the commandments, and he comes back frustrated with that because we think that it's like I've done all of that since I was a boy. Surely there's more to it than that. And most of us think it's got to be more to it than what we often hear and grow up, and how our discipleship usually goes of, well, just pray, read your Bible, and go to church. Right? There's got to be something more to it than that. Instinctively, we know it's more than that. And so if well done is on one end, what do you think is on the other end? Right? This one is being saved as though through the fire. This comes up in a couple of places. Jude chapter 1, he says, have mercy on those who are wavering, who are struggling in this walk. He says, save them by snatching them out of the fire, but on others have mercy with fear, hating even the garment defiled by the flesh. So there are some in the kingdom that it's as if they've had to be snatched right out of the fire. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 puts it like this, when he's talking about assessing our works and the things that we do in life as believers. If anyone's work built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. And if anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but as through fire. If anyone's work survives, there's reward. But if it doesn't, that's loss. Right? Some people will be snatched or pulled from the fire. That word in Jude is harpazo. It means, to seize or to carry off by force. It's almost like they're going down this way. It's almost like a little child running toward the road. Has anybody seen this happen? Or they're running toward an edge of something where they might fall off, and they're almost completely clueless about where they're going. And you can say all you want, now, little Johnny, don't go over there, stop. And how often do they listen? There's some times that come along when they don't listen, and what do you have to do? You have to go over there and beat them to it and grab them and pull them back. Otherwise, they're going to go right out into the street. Or otherwise, they're going to go right over the edge. That's the kind of picture that's here in that moment. Paul's word, when he's talking about in Corinthians, it suggests that all of a believer's life, everything that we have done since we have been saved, passes through that refiner's fire. All our work, all of our deeds, all of our accomplishments will only survive if it's built on the foundation, if it's built on the rock instead of the sand, the rock that is Messiah. Only what survives goes to the reward and contributes to hearing that one end of the spectrum of hearing, well done. And it says there will be a reward. Yeshua calls it, treasures in heaven. Store up for yourselves treasures in heavens. We're supposed to seek first the kingdom of God to do that, right? To get those treasures in heaven. Those are supposed to be more important to us than the treasures here on earth. Because what can happen to those treasures that are here on earth? Well, moth and rust can destroy stuff here. Thieves can come in and steal and destroy it, right? Paul talks about this reward in 2 Timothy. He says, in the future, talking about his own life, what he would like, what he expects to happen with his walk with God. He says, in the future, there is reserved for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, not to me only, but also to everyone who has longed for his appearing. Longing for his appearing. That's a vital part of our walk with him. That's a vital part of hearing, "Well done, my good and faithful servant," of receiving our reward, our crown, our treasures in heaven. Because if you don't live as if you're anticipating that future coming, if you don't live as if you are longing for his appearing, if you don't really look forward to that, it's not going to change anything about how you live today while we're waiting in the meantime. Hearing "well done" not going to happen because you have a large bank account. It's not going to happen. You're not going to hear that because you're famous or you're powerful. But it's from what happens in your life, what pleases and glorifies the King. Back in 1 Corinthians, he says, if anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but as through the fire. You will be saved because, as the excuse is, you've still got Jesus, right? You've still got him. Even a saved and redeemed believer, can they still suffer loss? Yeah, they can still suffer loss. All the things that they have acquired or accumulated in life, that can be gone. He implies that some believers on that day, standing before the King, we might lose a little bit. Some might lose a little bit. Some are going to lose more. Some might lose almost everything. Can you imagine what it would be like on that day to see all the things that you think you should get credit for? What the powerful, what the wealthy, what the famous have worked so hard for. Can you imagine being there and seeing all that stuff burned away like wood, hay, or stubble? That wouldn't be a very comfortable moment, would it? What would it be like for those who went to church every week to be saved, to be in the kingdom, but with little reward or little crown, with nothing essentially to show for it in that sense? Saved as though through the fire. Because we'll all experience some loss. We'll all have some things that will burn up. Not everything we've done in life pleases the King, glorifies him. Not everything is fit for the kingdom. Because we all are bringing it to him. We're all making it an offering to our King as living sacrifices. But not all of what we bring, not all of our deeds, our works will be accepted. When you think about that, what kind of ratio do you think you want to have? Do you think 50-50, right down the middle? Do you think that's going to get "well done, my good and faithful servant"? Anybody think that 50-50 is going to get "well done"? We're not talking about hamburgers here. Well done. Not that kind of well done. 50% reward, 50% loss. I mean, are we satisfied with that? Is that good enough? I'm not. I wouldn't be satisfied. I wouldn't be happy with that. Are you living? Are you prioritizing your life? What you spend, your time, your money, all those different things, is it more than a 50-50 ratio? That idea of being snatched out of the fire, that kind of brings to mind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember when they were thrown into the fiery furnace? Right? That's that kind of moment for them. But those guys, what's interesting about their situation, those guys had no indication or even smell or even a singe from the fire. But if it says on this end of that spectrum, if you are saved as though the fire, it's almost like there's still a bit of smell of smoke on you. I'm saved seems to be a step down from what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because these guys seem to be saved, but it's like they barely made it. They're not much different than maybe the thief on the cross, the one that's saved at the last possible second after a life of rebellion, essentially like a deathbed conversion, with no time to grow, no time to bear fruit, with nothing to bring that will survive the fire. You're glad you're there. You're glad you've made it. You have Yeshua. You've punched your ticket to heaven. You've got that fire insurance, as I remember it being called. Anybody else remember it being called fire insurance? How some people treat it? You carry it with you, but you never really want to use it or have it or make anything of it. He is the door. He is the gate. He is the way, the truth, and the life. You're in the kingdom. But it was close. How many believers want to volunteer for this and be that guy down on that end or on this end where you're saved through the fire? Does anybody want to be in the smoking section of the kingdom? No, not really. Nobody who's been praying, nobody who's been reading their Bible and going to church expects to be down on this end. But if we're honest with ourselves, because we know our thoughts, we know our faults, we know our failures, most of us, won't be too shocked or surprised if we don't necessarily warrant hearing well done. I know me. And you think about it, broad is the road that to destruction, and the road to the kingdom, his way, is narrow, right? And few find that, which means there's a lot of people who think they're on the narrow road. They're adjacent to the narrow road, but they're not really on it. And when you think about that narrow way, within the narrow way, when not everybody gets to hear well done, we're talking about the narrowest of an already narrow road. So again, what makes the difference between the two ends? Well, let's look at another description of what this means. When you're talking about well done, my good and faithful servant, or being saved through the fire, you could also call that being the least in the kingdom. And so that means if well done, my good and faithful servant would be what? Great. You would be great in the kingdom. Matthew talks about that in his Sermon on the Mount, or Yeshua does. He says, do not think that I came to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. He says, amen, I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or serif shall ever pass away from the Torah until all things come to pass. So the Torah is the one that is lifted up as the standard for all of this. He's not coming to do away with it. He's supposed to be bringing it about. And then he says this in the very next verses. He says, therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So that gives us some criteria here, doesn't it? How do you get down on this end of the spectrum? The least in the kingdom of heaven is someone who breaks even the least of the commandments, as James says, it's worse than that, because as James talks about, if you've broken one of them, it's as if you've done what? You've broken all of them. But the least in the kingdom believes that they are allowed to break the commandments, even the least of them, as they deem fit. They get to decide which ones they're going to keep and which ones have been annulled. They come up with theologies and strategies and interpretations to get around the commands of God, and then they teach those theologies and strategies and interpretations to everybody else, so they can all break and not keep certain commandments together. It's that misery loves company kind of thing. I don't want to do it by myself. I want to make sure I got other people here to do it with me, because that makes me feel better. All that Jewish stuff, I don't really need that stuff. I don't need to obey those commands, and I'm going to make sure I get other people to follow with me. For example, many will say there's a difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. We've been over some of these. The Old Testament's the God of law, and the New Testament is the God of grace. So that I don't have to keep that stuff, right? They'll say that he's operating with a different standard or dispensation. They'll make a distinction between the law of Moses and then the law of Christ. We've talked about that one. We're only obligated to the law of Christ, as if Yeshua taught something different and contrary to what came before. Or you'll hear about the breakdown or the division between the moral law, the ceremonial law, and the civil law. Anybody heard that one? Which one do we need to keep as believers? Well, we're told, grew up, we're just supposed to keep the moral law. We don't have to worry about being connected to those other things at all. You've heard me say, if you have a different law, you have a different king. Right? If you change the law, if you add to or subtract from it, you're acting as the king, because only the king has the authority to change the law, change the Torah. And so all of these theologies were created to justify ignoring certain commands, certain parts of scriptures, to ease the mind of the believer when it really boils down to it, they just don't want to obey or follow God's commands. And if you look at these words here in verse 19, teaching strategies that give permission for believers to not keep certain commands makes that teacher where on this scale? It puts them down there. Are they still in the kingdom? Yeah. And here's the other kicker, and I've shared this before. If you say, things like Jesus, he kept the law, so I don't have to, that Jesus gives us permission to not keep the Torah, to ignore those Jewish things. If we say that he teaches that you don't have to obey God's commands, where have you just put him on this scale? You've just put Jesus, Yeshua, down on that end where he is among the least in the kingdom. Is anybody comfortable putting Yeshua down at the least of the kingdom? You'd better not be. We don't realize the implication of the things that we say sometimes. But this verse also gives insight into what puts somebody on the other end. So not only do you want to keep the commands of God yourself, you want to model you want to teach it, you want to encourage others to keep you as well. He says, but whoever keeps and teaches them, this one shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. That's where you get to this side of well done, my good and faithful servant, and great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, think about this. If we want to be great in the kingdom, then you keep God's commandments yourself, and you teach others to do them as well. Is everybody comfortable saying that Yeshua is the greatest in the kingdom? I should hope so. He is by far the greatest in the kingdom. So that means he does what? He keeps the commands, and he does what? He teaches others to keep them as well. If he doesn't do that, he can't be the greatest in the kingdom. If the Father has said, this is my Son whom I love, with him I am well pleased, then he is going to be keeping the commands of God. He's not going to be breaking the Torah. He will be sinless. He's never going to encourage anybody else to break them. Now, can we keep God's commands as well as he does? No. Not perfectly. We cannot keep them enough to earn our place in the kingdom. We cannot do them well enough to be saved. But even as we read just a little bit earlier, his commands are not the burden that we grew up hearing. This mitzvah, these commands that I'm commanding you today, is not too difficult for you, nor is it far off. Verse 14, no, the word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart. For what purpose? To do it. Keeping his commands and teaching others to do so puts you on that path to hearing well done. And if you're not keeping his commands, you're teaching others not to keep his commands, you don't have much of a chance. Or your chance of hearing it is going up or down. If you're teaching others to not keep the commands, your chances are going down. Remember, there are saved and redeemed people. These are ones in the kingdom, even in the traditional churches that we came out of. So this part isn't talking about those to whom Yeshua says, depart from me, I never knew you. This is not that conversation. Remember also that those same people are keeping most of God's commands because Yeshua does teach them to. They're keeping most of the Torah, minus a few of these Jewish things, right? They've inherited some bad theology in regards to the Torah and some of God's commands, like regarding the Sabbath, like the feast, like the believer's relationship to the Torah. This bad teaching has been passed on for generations, with each successive generation just accepting the premise of that bad teaching. But who's most responsible for all of that? The ones who have inherited that bad teaching, or the ones who started doing the teaching in the first place? It goes back pretty far. It goes back to the second, third, and fourth centuries. The great thing about the times that we live in is that we just happen to be in a time when God is lifting the veil, where he is taking off the blinders. Most of us would have continued on in that same deception without ever realizing that we were missing out on it, apart from the grace of God, right? We would have parroted the same misinterpretations without question, without God intervening in some way to make us ask the question. For us it was Jacob and Passover that kind of kicked this journey off. Some of y'all have different starting points, right? Have y'all seen, Charlie Kirk has been keeping the Shabbat lately. He's been doing it from Friday night to Saturday evening. He's been talking about the 613 laws being relevant to believers today. He was moving in this direction. And I would have been interested in seeing where it went. And I don't think the enemy wanted to see where that went. Can you imagine if he had come in this direction, like we have made this kind of journey, with his personality, with his influence, with his presence? That could have been something. But here's the thing, one of the objections: are you saying that everybody who's not doing it exactly like we are, everybody who's not keeping the Torah, the Shabbat, the feast, that they're automatically down on this end of the spectrum, of the least end of the kingdom? That we're the only ones with a chance of hearing, "Well done, my good and faithful servant"? No, I'm not saying that at all. There are many who are pushing back against the darkness. They're getting killed for it around this world. Many who are around this world who are enduring persecution and death. Many who are teaching the scriptures and introducing people to Messiah. Again, even traditional Christians keep most of the Torah without even realizing it. No church really is out there preaching that it's okay to steal, right? I should hope not. They're not really out there teaching people to murder. Well, let me rephrase that. Except those that are, support abortion, those churches are kind of teaching that. Most of them aren't out there teaching it's okay to keep commit adultery. And you think about that, it's like, well, maybe there are a few who are wanting to redefine marriage and all those other kind of things, so you kind of wonder about that. But the ones who do take Scripture seriously and authoritatively do try to keep many to even most of the commandments and have committed their lives to the kingdom. Many of them serve faithfully. But again, decisions were made so long ago. Some of these commands of his are deemed too Jewish, and they're missing out on something. And it's important to say, can you be redeemed? Can you be saved and not keep every single command? Saved and not keep them perfectly? I sure hope you believe that. Otherwise, none of us, we'd all be in trouble if that were the case. We still break the commands too. Perfect theology is not the standard. Keeping the Torah perfectly is not the standard. It's faith in Messiah that is the standard for our justification and salvation. That's what Paul talks about. No human on the basis of Torah observance will be set right in his sight. So it is not based on deeds. Hello, I'm missing something there. How about that? Ephesians 2, for grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God. It's not based on deeds. Our redemption, our salvation, is not based on that, so that no one can boast. This whole thing about the range, it's about those who are already in the kingdom, who have been rescued from the kingdom of darkness, that are those who are citizens of the commonwealth of Israel, who are in the covenants of promise and adopted into the family. It's the Messiah who does that, who rescues us. Faith in Messiah and the promises of God, in the word, in the memra of Abraham, like Abraham. That's what does that. You know, as Hebrews talks about it, without faith it is impossible to please God. Without faith in his promise, without faith in his Messiah, it's impossible to do enough. For the one who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Faith is that starting point. But notice again, does God reward? Yes, he does. Redemption is a reward. Being in the kingdom is a reward, but it's not the only award. What happens afterward? Back in Ephesians 2, it says, we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we might walk in them. There are good deeds, good works that God has prepared for us to do as his people, as a redeemed person, a way of life that he calls us to live. And so what defines those good deeds in that way of life? It is the Torah. And his Torah includes what? Even that Jewish stuff that not everybody likes all that much, those things that people might want to write off. James says a life of faith is going to have these good works. You know, so also faith, if it does not have that accompanying life that works, is dead by itself. Someone will say, you have faith and I have works, but show me your faith without works, and I will show you faith by my works. Faith and works are not in opposition. They work in tandem. They have to be in their proper order. If you have genuine faith, you are going to have works that please him. But without faith, does anything we do please him? No. That's what Hebrews just said. Nothing we do pleases him. Our attempts at good works mean nothing. It's only after our faith can our works move us closer to hearing, well done. But remember, everything gets put through the fire. Only what pleases him remains and gets rewarded. Even that passage about well done talks about that Matthew 25 says, after a long time, the master of those servants to whom he gave certain talents came and settled accounts with them. That is, we know that is coming, right? There is a day when he is coming to settle accounts with us, right? We should live according to that reality. As the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought another 5 talents, saying, Master, you handed me 5 talents. Look, I have gained 5 more. And then his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful to little, so I'll put you in charge of much. That's the reward. Enter into your master's joy. You know, the parallel passage in Luke 19 talks about the faithful servant being put in charge of cities. But what he entrusts, when he gives us certain things, when he entrusts a gift, an ability, a plan, or a purpose to you. And that can be like this, that it can even be money or the ability to make money. What you do with it matters. If you prove to be faithful to what he has given you, he rewards that. Your place in that range can change. You can move in different directions. Or if you do nothing with what he has given you, if you neglect it, if you ignore it, if you abuse it, well, you might experience what he says here. You know, the one who had received the 1 talent also came up and said, Master, I knew that you are a hard man, reaping where you didn't sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went off and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master responded, you wicked, lazy servant. You knew that I reap where I didn't sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you should have brought my money to the brokers, and when I came, I could have received it back with interest. Therefore, take the talent away from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to the one who has, more shall be given, and he shall have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Where does that second guy fit on that range? Which direction is he moving? He's moving towards the least in the kingdom, isn't he? What you have can be taken away. It's like with Esther, what is said to her, that you have been raised up as queen for such a time as this. But if you don't stand up and be the instrument to save your people, what's going to happen to her? Salvation is going to come from and rise up from somewhere else, isn't it? If you don't do what I've entrusted you to do, I'm still going to make it happen. But you and your family, you'll all be killed. The scariest part with all of this, if God has given you something, if he has called you to something, and you purposely avoid it or reject it, you're kind of proving that you don't really belong to him at all. That's how this passage ends. Says, throw the worthless servant out into outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Right? That's concerning. Faith in Messiah gets you in the range for both Jew and Gentile. Again, what affects your place on that range? Faithfulness. Faithfulness to what he has entrusted to you determines and makes a difference in where. Walking and living by faith determines where. Loving Adonai, your God, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which, as Yeshua said, if you love me, you do what with my commands? You keep them. The greatest among you will be my servants, or servants of each other. And when his kingdom arrives and Messiah is on the throne, we were saying about this earlier, all nations are going to go up to Zion. Torah will go forth from Zion, and all those who come will be, even coming from the nations, will be taught his ways, how to keep his Torah, and then they're supposed to take it home to their countries and do what? Teach everybody else how to keep his Torah. What kind of people is he encouraging them to be? People who keep my commandments and teach others to do so. So you will be what? Great in the kingdom. That's the guaranteed future. That's a pretty good indicator of what he would like to see in his people around the world as much as possible today. Yeshua and his followers have done a lot of that, spreading Torah and most of the commands of God around the world. And yes, Shabbat, the feast, that's all a part of it. Even this week's Torah portion, the Haftorah, lays out the blessings for the people and the nation that keep his commands and the curses for those who break it. Isaiah 56 shows that God even wants Gentiles and outcasts to keep his ways. This is talking about that future. Because the foreigners who join themselves to Adonai to minister to him, to love the name of Adonai, and to be his servants, all who keep from profaning the Jewish stuff, Shabbat, and hold fast to my covenant. These I will bring to my holy mountain, and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar. It will pass through the fire, and it survives. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. This is what the kingdom of Messiah is supposed to look like, that he is pleased when the non-Jews come to worship him. He rejoices when the Gentiles don't profane Shabbat, when foreigners keep and hold fast to his covenant along with his Jewish people. He will bless them. He will bring them into the temple and accept their offerings. And so by rejecting some of the Torah, there's a lot of people who are missing out on the things that please him, missing what he rewards. Kind of like what happened to me at least once, and I'm afraid it probably happened more than once, in school when I was taking a test. Anybody been there taking tests in school? I remember one time, and again, I'm afraid it's more than one, where I finished one page of the test, and I grabbed it and was flipping to the next page, and you accidentally grab more than one page? Anybody ever have that happen to you, or am I just the lucky one? You're on page 1 and you grab that and you flip it over and you're like, that now I'm on page 4 without even realizing it. That's happened to me. And I finished my test before everybody else, so I thought I had done great. I thought I must have aced this test because I'm clearly doing better at this than everybody else is. I'm surely going to have 100 on my test. But by skipping that page, even unintentionally, am I going to get 100 on my test? Nope. I don't have a chance of getting 100 on my test. 100 was not even possible. I may do perfect on every other page of that test, but I will never get 100 because I inadvertently skipped some things. For whatever reason, they didn't ask, why did you not do this page? It counted against me. And that might not matter much for some people, because they're saying, hey, I'm just here, I'm just cruising through, I'm doing all of that. But what if I was in close competition to be great in my graduating class? What if I was in the top 3 for being valedictorian, right? That did not happen to me, by the way. But that one error, could that prevent me from getting valedictorian? Yes, it could. It sure could. It may prevent me from hearing that my name is announced in that position. See, the scriptures talk a lot about things that need to be a part of the redeemed person's life. We've already talked about not just keeping his commands, but also teaching others to do so. That makes a difference. Loving your neighbor as yourself makes a difference. Caring for orphans and widows and those helpless ones. Growing as a disciple. Making others disciples. Carrying one another's burdens and thereby fulfilling the law of Messiah. Forgiving as you have been forgiven. Even 70 times 7. Right, which is a way of saying until the arrival of the kingdom. He talks about various places crucifying the flesh and its desires and living for the kingdom, submitting to God and doing what? Resisting the devil. That's an important part. Putting on the armor of God and taking your stand against the devil's schemes, being an ambassador for this king and this kingdom with that message of reconciliation, worshiping him in spirit and in truth, because he is seeking people. He is seeking worshipers like that. He also says it's important to be holy as I am holy. Loving and following him more than this world, even if that includes family. We in the West tend to think that those are all abstract concepts and ideas. But to the Jewish mind, the one that knows the Torah understands that all of those statements are talked about and explained where? In the Torah. The reason why Yeshua says, depart from me, I never knew you, is because they were workers of lawlessness, people who don't know or know how to live with and in the Torah, who don't keep the commands, nor do they teach others to do so. There's even what we've seen, again, happening a lot over in Africa. It's happening more here where churches and people are targeted because of their faith. When you're laying down your life, being willing to die rather than deny Yeshua or refusing to give up being a faithful servant. All of those are factors. Charlie Kirk had many threats against him. He had security. He had been warning about assassinations for the last year. He knew that was a strong possibility. But he continued to go out and testify to his faith and to the truth. Do we know that those threats are out there? Yeah. We have to be willing to live for it. He finished well. I've heard people say that you died well as a follower of Messiah when the demonic is celebrating your death. And we've been seeing a lot of that. And that's one of the most important things to consider when wanting to hear well done. It's finishing well, enduring to the end. Whenever that end happens to come, those who endure to the end will be saved. This is how we overcome and hear well done, especially in the face of the enemy's attacks. We know that this is where the world is going. There's an escalation that's going on. The dragon became enraged at the woman, went off to make war with the rest of her offspring. And who is he targeting? Those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua the Messiah. Right? He says, they overcame him in verse 11 by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives even in the face of death. Lastly, in considering his life and being faithful to the end, Paul said a couple of things as an example to all who want to hear well done. Not just to say I made it, not just to say I'm in, I've got my ticket punched, but to want to hear well done. Philippians 3, he says, not that I've already obtained this kind of perfect state or been perfected, but I press on, if only I might take hold of that for which Messiah Yeshua took hold of me. What the purpose that he took hold of me for, I'm going to keep doing. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself as having taken hold of it. I'm not finished. But this one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead. I'm not going to rely on what I've already done. I'm going to start and continue to look towards what I still have to do, what he gives me to do. As I press on toward the goal for the reward of that upward calling of God in Messiah Yeshua. There is a goal. There is a reward for those who endure and never quit, even through hardship, even through persecution and death. As Psalm 84 talks about, I'd rather be, I'm content, I'm happy to be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell among the tents of the wicked. Right? We can be in and be happy, and I'm glad to be there. Even if I am the least in the kingdom, I'm still there. But those who are pressing on toward the goal, living for that future, that's pleasing to our God and our King. Well done is for those who give him everything. Living not for this world, but for the world that is to come, and longing for his appearing. He says, for I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. He knows. He says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. He says, in the future, there is reserved for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not to me only. So it's not just for people like Paul. It's not just that there's only one, and I'm going to get it, and you're just out of luck. He will award to me on that day, and not to me only, but to everyone who has longed for his appearing. That can be you. That can be me. That can be us. Where we all come to hear, well done, my good and faithful servant. I want to hear that. Don't you?